The brass key turned with surprising ease in the library door, releasing the scent of leather and decades-old dust into the hallway. Amelia stepped across the threshold, her wedding dress still rustling with each movement, though she'd changed from the ceremony hours ago. The Fenwick estate library stretched before her like a cathedral of knowledge, floor-to-ceiling shelves carved from dark mahogany, their surfaces gleaming despite years of neglect. Afternoon sunlight filtered through tall windows, illuminating particles that danced in the air like tiny spirits. Thomas said I could explore anywhere I wished, she whispered to herself, running her fingers along the spine of a volume on cattle ranching. The silence felt heavy, expectant, as if the room had been waiting for someone to break its solitude. Her boots clicked against the hardwood as she moved deeper into the space, drawn to an ornate desk position beneath the largest window. Its surface bore the scratches and stains of generations of use, and centered upon it sat a massive leather-bound tome. The cover bore no title, only an embossed symbol she didn't recognize, something between a tree and a twisted cross. Amelia opened the book carefully, its hinges protesting with a soft creak. The pages were thick, cream-colored, and filled with meticulous handwriting in black ink. At the top of the first page, elegant script proclaimed, "The Fenwick Family Record, established 1847." Her heart quickened as she realized what she held. This was the family's genealogical record, a complete history of births, marriages, and deaths stretching back to when Thomas's grandfather first claimed land in East Texas. She traced her finger down the entries, marveling at the detailed recordings. Each life had been documented with care, dates of birth, marriage, children, and ultimately, death. Jonathan Fenwick, born March 15, 1825, married to Elizabeth Harper, June 2, 1847, she read aloud. Children, Thomas Sr., born 1849, Mary Catherine, born 1851, William James, born 1854. The entries continued, page after page, chronicling the growth of the family through the Civil War, Reconstruction, and into the new century. She found Thomas's father, then Thomas himself, born in 1865. Her own name appeared on the final filled page, Thomas Fenwick Jr. married to Amelia Catherine Morrison, October 12, 1889. But as she turned to the next page, expecting to find space for future children, future generations, she found something that made her breath catch in her throat. The page was blank. Not just empty, deliberately blank, with a stark line drawn beneath the last entry in 1912. Every page that followed had been torn out, leaving only ragged edges along the binding. "That's strange," she murmured, flipping through the remainder of the book. Someone had methodically removed every page meant to record the family's future, leaving behind a history that simply ended. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made her look up. Thomas appeared in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the afternoon light. Even from across the room, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched at his sides. "I see you found the family record," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Thomas, this is fascinating," Amelia replied, gesturing to the open book. "Your family's history is so detailed, so carefully maintained. But I don't understand, why does it stop in 1912? Surely there have been births and deaths since then. Your Aunt Cordelia, for instance, where is she recorded?" Thomas stepped into the room, but didn't approach the desk. Instead, he moved to one of the tall windows, staring out at the sprawling grounds beyond. "Some records are incomplete." "Incomplete?" Amelia stood, the book still open in her hands. "Thomas, this isn't incomplete. Someone deliberately removed these pages. Look at the binding, you can see where they were torn out." "Amelia." His voice carried a warning now, low and tense. "Please close the book." She stared at him, surprised by the sudden change in his demeanor. This morning, he had been the gentle, attentive husband she'd fallen in love with. Now, something haunted shadowed his features, aging him beyond his 24 years. "I don't understand," she said softly. "What happened in 1912? Thomas turned from the window, and she saw something in his eyes that made her stomach clench: fear. Not the ordinary fear of embarrassment or family scandal, but something deeper, more primal. "Nothing happened in 1912, he said, but his voice shook with the effort of speaking the lie. "The record keeper died, and the tradition was abandoned. But surely someone else could have continued." "Amelia." The sharpness of his tone made her flinch. "I said the tradition was abandoned. Some family histories are better left buried." The silence that followed stretched between them like a chasm. Amelia looked down at the ledger, then back at her husband's pale face. Something cold settled in her chest, the first whisper of doubt about the family she had married into. "I'm sorry," Thomas said, running a hand through his dark hair. "It's been a long day, and there are difficult memories associated with that book. My father always said it was bad luck to dwell on the past too much." Amelia closed the ledger slowly, but her fingers lingered on its leather cover. "Of course. I didn't mean to pry." "You're not prying. You're family now. This is your home, your history too." He crossed the room and took her hands in his, but she noticed they were trembling slightly. I need you to trust me on this. Some things are better left alone." She looked into his eyes, those warm brown eyes that had convinced her to leave her family's farm in Virginia and travel to this remote corner of Texas. "I trust you, Thomas. But I hope someday you'll trust me enough to share whatever burden you're carrying." He kissed her forehead, but she felt the tension in his lips. "Someday, perhaps. But not today." As they left the library together, Amelia glanced back at the desk where the ledger sat. The afternoon light had shifted, casting long shadows across its surface, and for just a moment, she could have sworn she saw something moving across the cover, a shadow that didn't belong to either of them. That night, as she lay beside Thomas in their marriage bed, listening to his restless breathing, Amelia stared at the ceiling and wondered what had happened to the Fenwick family in 1912. And why, after 27 years, her husband still looked like a man haunted by ghosts. The question would not let her sleep. Outside their window, the Texas wind whispered through the oak trees, and somewhere in the distance, she thought she heard the sound of crying, soft, mournful sobs that seemed to come from beneath the earth itself. If you discovered your new family's records mysteriously ended decades ago, would you keep digging, or trust your husband's warning to let it rest? The morning brought no relief from the questions that had plagued Amelia's sleep. She woke to an empty bed. Thomas had already left for his business in town, and the memory of those missing pages burned bright in her mind. Coffee and breakfast with the silent housekeeper, Mrs. Hutchins, did little to settle her unease. "Mrs. Hutchins," Amelia ventured as the older woman cleared away the dishes, "how long have you worked for the Fenwick family?" The woman's hand stilled on the china teacup. "Near on 15 years, ma'am." "Then you would have known Thomas's parents before they passed." I knew them." Mrs. Hutchins resumed her careful stacking, but Amelia noticed the slight tremor in her weathered fingers. "Good people, they were. Generous employers. And other family members. I understand there's an aunt, Cordelia. Miss Cordelia keeps to her rooms mostly. She's delicate, you might say." The housekeeper's voice carried a note of warning. "Best not to disturb her without invitation, ma'am." Amelia nodded, but her curiosity only deepened. After Mrs. Hutchins departed for the kitchen, she found herself drawn upstairs to explore more of her new home. The second floor stretched in both directions from the main staircase, lined with doors that led to bedrooms, sitting rooms, and storage areas she had yet to investigate. At the far end of the east wing, she discovered a set of double doors that opened into what must have once been a grand portrait gallery. The room ran the length of the house, with tall windows on one side and an impressive collection of oil paintings on the other. These would be Thomas's ancestors, she realized, the faces that matched the names in the family ledger. The earliest portraits near the entrance showed stern-faced men and women in the formal dress of the mid-1800s. Jonathan Fenwick, the family patriarch, stood with his hand on his wife's shoulder, both of them staring directly at the artist with the confident gaze of people building something meant to last. Their children appeared in smaller portraits nearby, young faces full of promise and determination. Amelia moved slowly down the gallery, watching the family's story unfold in oil and canvas. The clothing styles changed with the decades, the poses became less formal, but the strong Fenwick features remained consistent, the square jaw, the intelligent eyes, the slight tilt of the head that she recognized in Thomas. But as she reached the section that would have corresponded to the 20th century, something made her stop in horror. Every portrait after 1912 had been deliberately destroyed. The canvases remained in their frames, but the faces had been scraped away with such violence that in some places the paint had been gouged down to the bare wood. Some appeared to have been burned, leaving black, twisted remnants where features should have been. Others looked as though acid had been poured over them, dissolving the carefully rendered faces into abstract smears of color. "Dear God," Amelia whispered, approaching one of the damaged paintings. The placard beneath identified it as, Thomas Fenwick Sr. and Family, 1914, but where faces should have been, only raw canvas and charred paint remained. Terrible, isn't it? Amelia spun around to find a young woman standing in the doorway, one of the maids, judging by her simple dress and apron. She was perhaps 18, with worried eyes and work-roughened hands that she twisted nervously in her apron strings. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Didn't mean to startle you. I'm Sarah, one of the cleaning girls. Mrs. Hutchins sent me to dust in here." "Sarah, what happened to these paintings?" The girl glanced nervously toward the door before stepping closer. "Nobody talks about it, ma'am. But the older servants, they remember. They say there was a fire." "A fire? But the frames aren't burned, only the faces." "Not that kind of fire, ma'am." Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "They call it the cleansing fire. Happened in 1912, right after the trouble started." Amelia's heart began to race. What kind of trouble? Sarah looked around again, as if afraid of being overheard. "I shouldn't say, ma'am. Mrs. Hutchins would have my position if she knew I was gossiping. Please, Sarah. I'm family now. I have a right to know." The girl bit her lip, clearly torn between fear and sympathy. Finally, she stepped closer and spoke in barely a whisper. "They say someone in the family made a terrible bargain. Sold their souls for wealth and power. And when the consequences came due..." She gestured toward the ruined portraits. "The family tried to erase all evidence of what came after." "Who told you this?" "My grandmother worked here before me. She was here during the cleansing." Said the screaming went on for 3 days, and when it was over, Master Fenwick ordered every portrait after 1912 to be destroyed. Said the faces in them weren't human anymore. A chill ran down Amelia's spine. "What do you mean, not human anymore?" Sarah shook her head, backing toward the door. "I've said too much already, ma'am. Please don't tell Mrs. Hutchins we spoke of this." "Wait, Sarah." But the girl had already fled, leaving Amelia alone with the mutilated portraits. She approached another damaged painting, this one labeled, "The Fenwick Children, 1915. 4 small figures sat in posed formal wear, but their faces had been scraped away with such fury that the canvas was torn in places. The silence in the gallery felt oppressive now, as if the eyeless portraits were watching her despite their destroyed features. She could almost imagine she heard whispers echoing from the damaged canvases, voices calling out warnings she couldn't quite understand. Amelia? She turned to find Thomas standing in the doorway, his face ashen. What are you doing in here? I was exploring the house. Thomas, what happened to these portraits? He stepped into the gallery but stopped several feet away from her, as if reluctant to come closer to the damaged paintings. They were destroyed in an accident. Years ago. An accident? Amelia gestured to the systematic destruction around them. Thomas, this wasn't an accident. Someone deliberately destroyed every face painted after 1912. The same year the family record ends. Amelia, please. His voice carried the same strained quality she'd heard in the library. Come away from here. This room, it's not safe. Not safe? What do you mean, not safe? Thomas moved to her side and took her arm, gently but firmly guiding her toward the door. The floorboards are rotted in places. You could fall through. But his eyes never left the ruined portraits, and she saw something in his expression that made her blood run cold, recognition. As if he knew the faces that had once looked out from those destroyed canvases. As they left the gallery, Amelia heard footsteps on the floor above them, slow, deliberate steps moving back and forth in a room directly overhead. Who's upstairs? Aunt Cordelia, Thomas replied, but he didn't look up. She's been unwell lately. The doctor says she needs rest. The footsteps stopped suddenly, as if whoever was walking had heard their voices. In the silence that followed, Amelia could have sworn she heard someone weeping, soft, heartbroken sobs that seemed to seep through the ceiling itself. Thomas, she said quietly, I think I should meet your aunt. His grip on her arm tightened almost painfully. Not today, Amelia. Please. She's not herself lately. But as they walked away from the portrait gallery, Amelia looked back once and saw something that made her steps falter. In one of the damaged portraits, a family group from 1913, she could swear she saw movement in the burned and scraped canvas. Just for a moment, like shadows shifting behind the destroyed paint, as if something was trying to push through from the other side. That evening, as Thomas worked in his study with the door firmly closed, Amelia sat in their bedroom and thought about cleansing fires and mutilated faces. Outside, the October wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the house above her, those slow, measured footsteps began again, pacing back and forth like someone keeping a vigil over secrets too terrible to name. 3 days passed before Amelia found the courage to venture into the basement. Thomas had been called away to Austin on business, something about cattle contracts and railroad disputes, leaving her alone with the servants and the growing weight of questions no one seemed willing to answer. Mrs. Hutchins maintained her polite but distant demeanor, Sarah avoided her entirely after their conversation in the portrait gallery, and the mysterious Aunt Cordelia remained sequestered in her upstairs rooms. The basement stairs creaked under Amelia's weight as she descended, oil lamp held high to push back the darkness. The space beneath the house was larger than she'd expected, a series of connected rooms carved from the red clay earth and reinforced with stone and timber. The air smelled of damp earth and something else, something organic and unsettling that made her stomach turn. The first room contained the usual basement storage, preserves, root vegetables, barrels of flour and grain. But as she moved deeper into the subterranean space, following a narrow corridor that seemed to stretch toward the heart of the house, she discovered rooms that served no purpose she could understand. The corridor ended in a round chamber with a low, vaulted ceiling. And there, arranged in perfect concentric circles across the earthen floor, were dozens of wooden boxes. Amelia set her lamp on a stone ledge and knelt beside the nearest box. It was roughly the size of a shoebox, crafted from dark wood and secured with a simple brass latch. No markings or labels adorned its surface, but when she lifted it, something rattled softly inside. Her hands trembled as she opened the latch. Inside, nestled in faded silk, lay a collection of personal belongings that took her breath away. A woman's wedding ring, delicate and gold, engraved with a date, June 14, 1913. A lock of brown hair tied with a blue ribbon. A small silver locket containing the photograph of a young man she didn't recognize. And beneath it all, a folded piece of paper with a name written in careful script, Mary Elizabeth Fenwick. Mary Elizabeth, Amelia whispered. The name wasn't in the family ledger, none of the entries after 1912 had been recorded. But here was evidence that Mary Elizabeth Fenwick had existed, had married, had been loved enough that someone had preserved these intimate mementos. She opened another box, then another. Each contained similar treasures, jewelry, photographs, letters, children's toys. Each bore a name that should have appeared in the family record but didn't. James William Fenwick. Catherine Ann Fenwick. Thomas Michael Fenwick, not her Thomas, but someone else who had shared his name. The boxes formed a pattern, she realized, studying their arrangement in the lamplight. The outer rings contained boxes labeled with dates from 1913 and 1914. As the circles moved inward, the dates grew more recent, 1925, 1934, 1945. The innermost circle bore dates from the 1960s and 1970s, and at the very center sat a single box that seemed newer than the others, its wood still bearing the faint scent of fresh sawdust. Amelia approached it with growing dread. The latch opened smoothly, and inside she found a baby's christening gown, never worn, still crisp with starch. A silver rattle that had never been shaken. And a card with a name written in Thomas's handwriting, Thomas Edward Fenwick IV, born and called home, April 3, 1888. Dear God, she breathed. Thomas had had a child who had died, or been taken, before she'd ever met him. But he'd never mentioned a previous marriage, never spoken of loss or grief. You shouldn't be down here. Amelia spun around to find a figure silhouetted in the corridor entrance, a thin, elderly woman in a nightgown and shawl, holding a candle that cast dancing shadows across her gaunt face. Aunt Cordelia? Amelia managed. The old woman stepped into the chamber, and Amelia saw that her hair hung in long, silver strands around a face that might once have been beautiful but now bore the weight of decades of sorrow. Her eyes were the same brown as Thomas's, but they held a depth of anguish that made Amelia want to look away. You found the inheritance, Cordelia said, her voice barely above a whisper. I wondered when you would. I don't understand. What is this place? Cordelia moved among the boxes with the careful steps of someone navigating a graveyard. This is what remains of the Fenwick family. Everyone who should have lived, should have grown old, should have had children of their own. She knelt beside one of the older boxes and touched it with reverent fingers. They're all here. All the stolen futures. Stolen futures. Sit down, child. Cordelia gestured to a wooden crate against the wall. It's time you knew what you married into. Amelia remained standing, but Cordelia continued as if she hadn't noticed. In 1912, the Fenwick family faced ruin. Drought had killed the cattle, the banks were calling in their loans, and bankruptcy loomed. My grandfather, Thomas's great-grandfather, was a proud man who couldn't bear the thought of losing everything he'd built. Cordelia's voice took on the rhythm of an oft-told tale, as if she'd recited this history many times before. So he made a bargain. There are things in this world, child, that feed on human potential, on the lives that could have been lived, the children who could have been born, the love that could have been shared. He summoned one of these entities and offered it a trade, the future of his bloodline in exchange for wealth and power that would last forever. Amelia's legs finally gave out, and she sank onto the crate. That's impossible. Is it? Cordelia gestured to the boxes around them. Look at the evidence. Every child born to the Fenwick family after 1912 has been claimed before their first birthday. Their potential, all the decades of life they should have lived, feeds the creature that lives beneath this house. And in return, the family prospers. The cattle multiply, the investments never fail, the land continues to yield its bounty year after year. But Thomas is alive. You're alive. I was born in 1911, just months before the pact was sealed. I am the last Fenwick child to live past infancy. Cordelia's eyes filled with tears. And Thomas. Thomas was not born a Fenwick. His father adopted him from an orphanage in San Antonio, brought him into the family to continue the name. But adoption doesn't change blood, and blood is what the creature requires. The chamber seemed to spin around Amelia as the implications crashed over her. The baby in the center box. Thomas's first child with his first wife, Elizabeth. She died in childbirth, and the baby lived for 3 days before. Cordelia's voice broke. Before it was time to pay the debt again. Thomas knows about this. Thomas has fought against it his entire life. He left the estate for 10 years, thinking distance would break the curse. But the entity calls its debtors home, and eventually, they always return. Cordelia stood, her candle flame wavering. He married you because he hoped, he prayed, that maybe this time would be different. That maybe love could overcome the pact. Amelia thought of Thomas's strange behavior, his reluctance to speak of family history, the haunted look in his eyes. The creature, where is it? Below us. Far below. It sleeps most of the time, but when a Fenwick child is born. Cordelia shuddered. It stirs. It rises through the earth and claims what it's owed. And if someone refused to pay, the entire bloodline dies. Every Fenwick, every descendant, withers and dies within 7 days. The creature takes its payment in full rather than installments. Cordelia moved toward the corridor. You should leave this place, child. Leave tonight, before you're carrying Thomas's child. Save yourself while you still can. I can't leave Thomas. Then you'll watch your child die in its cradle, just as I've watched every Fenwick baby for nearly 80 years. Cordelia's voice echoed from the corridor as she disappeared into the darkness. The inheritance always comes due. Alone in the chamber of boxes, Amelia wept for children she'd never known, for a husband who carried an impossible burden, and for the future that might already be growing inside her. Above her, the house settled with creaks and sighs that sounded almost like breathing, and deep beneath her feet, something ancient and hungry stirred in its earthen sleep. When she finally climbed the stairs back to the main floor, dawn was breaking over the Texas plains, and she carried with her the terrible knowledge that some debts can never be fully paid, only passed from one generation to the next, like a poisoned inheritance that grows stronger with each exchange. Would you try to break a generational curse that's kept your family rich but cost them their souls, or accept the wealth and let the darkness continue? Dr. Samuel Morrison's weathered hands were gentle as he completed his examination, but his eyes held a sadness that Amelia recognized all too well. It was the same look she'd seen in Thomas's face, in Cordelia's haunted stare, in her own reflection each morning since discovering the root cellar. "Congratulations, Mrs. Fenwick," he said quietly, packing his instruments back into his black bag. "You're about 2 months along. The baby should arrive sometime in late spring." Amelia nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. In the 3 weeks since Thomas had returned from Austin, she hadn't found the courage to tell him about her discovery, hadn't known how to voice the questions that burned inside her. Now those questions seemed irrelevant. If Cordelia's story was true, she was carrying a child who would live for mere days before being claimed by something that shouldn't exist. "Mrs. Fenwick," Dr. Morrison continued, his voice unusually hesitant, "I delivered Thomas's first child. I've been the family physician for nearly 30 years, and I've delivered." He paused, seeming to struggle with his words. I've delivered many Fenwick babies. Perhaps we should discuss the birthing arrangements. What do you mean? The family has a special room prepared for births. Very traditional, very private. But I want you to know that you have choices. You could give birth in town, at the new hospital in Marshall. Or I could arrange for you to travel to Dallas or Houston, where there are modern facilities. His emphasis on the word choices made Amelia's heart race. Dr. Morrison, what happened to Thomas's first child? The old physician closed his bag with trembling fingers. Infant mortality is unfortunately common, especially in isolated areas. Sometimes babies simply fail to thrive. That's not what I asked. Dr. Morrison met her eyes for the first time since delivering his news. Mrs. Fenwick, there are things in this world that medicine cannot explain or cure. If you have any reason to believe your child might be in danger, any reason at all, I urge you to consider having this baby somewhere far from here. Before Amelia could respond, the sound of boots on the stairs announced Thomas's arrival. Dr. Morrison straightened, his professional demeanor sliding back into place like a mask. Thomas, he said as her husband appeared in the bedroom doorway. Congratulations. Your wife is expecting. The color drained from Thomas's face so completely that Amelia thought he might faint. He gripped the doorframe for support, his knuckles white with strain. How far along? He asked in a voice barely above a whisper. About 2 months. The baby should arrive in May. Thomas nodded mechanically, but Amelia saw the calculations running behind his eyes, the terrible arithmetic of counting days until the creature below would wake again. After Dr. Morrison departed, they sat in silence in their bedroom, the weight of unspoken knowledge heavy between them. Finally, Thomas spoke. I should show you the birthing room. Thomas. No. His voice was firm, but she heard the desperation beneath it. If you're going to have our child in this house, you need to see it. You need to understand. The birthing room was located on the ground floor, in a wing of the house Amelia had never explored. Thomas led her through a series of increasingly narrow hallways until they reached a heavy oak door reinforced with iron bands. This room has been used for Fenwick births for over 70 years, Thomas said as he turned the key. It was specially prepared. The door swung open to reveal a chamber that took Amelia's breath away, but not with beauty. The room was circular, with walls of rough stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. At the center stood an ornate bed with carved posts that twisted upward like thorn vines. But it was the floor that made Amelia stumble backward in horror. Carved into the stone was an intricate pattern of symbols and lines that hurt to look at directly. The design seemed to shift and writhe when she wasn't focusing on it, as if the very stone was alive with malevolent purpose. Dark stains had soaked into the carved channels, stains that looked disturbingly like dried blood. My God, Thomas. What is this place? It's a summoning chamber. His voice was hollow, defeated. The symbols call to the entity below. The bed is positioned at the exact center of the pattern, so that when a child is born. He couldn't finish the sentence. You brought Elizabeth here. You let her give birth in this horrible place. I tried to stop it. I begged her to leave, to go to her sister in New Orleans. But the family, the pressure. Thomas sank against the doorframe. The entity's influence grows stronger as the birth approaches. By the time Elizabeth went into labor, she couldn't think clearly. She insisted on following tradition, on doing what was expected. Amelia approached the bed, her skin crawling as she examined the carved headboard. The symbols were burned into the wood, not carved, but seared in as if by tremendous heat. What happens during the birth? The mother delivers normally, but something else is born with the child. A shadow that takes the baby's potential, all the years it should have lived, all the experiences it should have had. The child appears healthy at first, but within hours, it begins to fade. By the third day. Thomas's voice broke. By the third day, there's nothing left but an empty shell. And the mother? The mothers rarely survive the trauma. Elizabeth lasted 6 months before her heart simply stopped. The physician said it was grief, but I knew better. Part of her had been consumed along with our son. Amelia backed away from the bed, her hand instinctively moving to her still flat stomach. We won't do this, Thomas. We'll leave. We'll go to California, to New York, anywhere the curse can't follow. Don't you think I've tried? Thomas's laugh was bitter. The entity doesn't just claim children, Amelia. It owns the bloodline. Every Fenwick who tries to escape is drawn back by forces beyond their control. My father tried to flee in 1923, made it as far as Chicago before he felt the pull. He was back within a month, drawn by dreams and visions and a hunger he couldn't explain. Then we'll fight it. There must be a way to break the pact. How do you fight something that exists beyond death, beyond time? How do you battle a creature that feeds on potential itself? Thomas moved to the window, a small, barred opening that looked out onto the family cemetery. Every generation has tried, Amelia. Every father who's had to watch his child die has searched for answers. The library is full of books on demonology, exorcism, ancient contracts. None of it works. Cordelia said the entire bloodline would die if the debt wasn't paid. Yes. 7 days of agony as our life force is slowly drained away. I've often thought it might be a mercy. Thomas turned from the window, and in his eyes she saw something that terrified her more than any carved symbol or blood-stained floor: resignation. At least then, the suffering would end. Thomas, don't talk like that. Our child. Our child will die, Amelia. Just like my first son, just like every Fenwick child for nearly 80 years. And you'll watch it happen, because that's part of the bargain too. The parents must witness the claiming, must feel every moment of loss, or the contract isn't fulfilled. Amelia sank onto a chair near the door, her legs too weak to support her. There has to be another way. If there is, I haven't found it. And believe me, I've looked. Thomas joined her, taking her hands in his cold fingers. I love you, Amelia. I loved you so much that I convinced myself maybe this time would be different. Maybe love could overcome the curse. But love isn't enough. It's never been enough. They sat in the horrible room as afternoon shadows lengthened across the carved floor, and Amelia felt the weight of generations pressing down on her. Somewhere in the walls around them, she could swear she heard the sound of babies crying, not the healthy wails of newborns, but the weak, fading whispers of children being slowly drained of life. When? She asked finally. The entity will start to stir when you enter your 7th month. By your 8th month, the symbols on the floor will begin to glow. And when your labor begins. Thomas squeezed her hands. When your labor begins, you won't be able to leave this room. The curse will compel you here, just as it compelled Elizabeth, just as it's compelled every Fenwick mother for decades. That night, as Thomas slept fitfully beside her, Amelia lay awake planning her escape. If she left now, while the pregnancy was still early, perhaps she could break free of whatever influence held the family. She could disappear into one of the growing cities, raise her child far from the reach of ancient hungers. But even as she made her plans, she felt something stirring in the depths of the house, a subtle shift in the air, a whisper of movement from far below. The entity was already aware of the new life growing inside her, already beginning to wake from its patient slumber. And as dawn broke over the Fenwick estate, Amelia realized with growing horror that she was no longer planning an escape, she was counting the days until her imprisonment in the birthing room would begin. January brought an ice storm that coated the Fenwick estate in a crystalline shell, transforming the familiar landscape into something alien and treacherous. Amelia watched from her bedroom window as tree branches bowed under the weight of ice, some snapping with sounds like gunshots that echoed across the frozen plains. The storm had trapped them all inside for 3 days, and the isolation was beginning to fray everyone's nerves. Her pregnancy was showing now, a gentle curve beneath her winter dress that made Thomas's eyes darken with worry whenever he looked at her. For months along, and already she could feel something changing in the house around her. The servants whispered more frequently in corners, their conversation stopping abruptly when she appeared. Mrs. Hutchins had taken to leaving small protective charms in Amelia's room, sprigs of rosemary, iron nails, circles of salt that she swept away each morning without explanation. Most disturbing of all were the dreams. Every night now, Amelia found herself standing in the birthing room, watching shadows move across the carved symbols on the floor. In these dreams, she could hear voices calling from beneath the stone, not threatening or angry, but infinitely patient, like hunters who knew their prey had nowhere to run. The knock on her bedroom door came just after midnight on the 3rd night of the storm. Amelia woke to find Cordelia standing in the hallway, a candle in one hand and a leather portfolio in the other. "It's time you saw the contract," the old woman said without preamble. "Time you understood exactly what your child is walking into." Amelia pulled on her robe and followed Cordelia through the dark house to a small sitting room she'd never entered before. The space was cramped and cluttered, filled with books, papers, and artifacts that seemed to absorb the candlelight. Cordelia settled into a worn armchair and gestured for Amelia to take the seat across from her. "I've been the keeper of family secrets for 78 years, Cordelia began, opening the portfolio on her lap. "Every detail, every clause, every loophole in that damned bargain, I know them all by heart." She withdrew a document that made Amelia's breath catch. The parchment was yellow with age and covered in script that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering candlelight. Some passages were written in English, others in languages she didn't recognize, and still others in symbols that hurt to look at directly. "The Covenant of Bloodline Tribute," Cordelia read from the top of the document. "Agreed upon this day of October 31st, 1912, between Jeremiah Fenwick, patriarch of the Fenwick line, and the entity of endless hunger, guardian of potential unfulfilled." "It's real," Amelia whispered. "As real as the child growing inside you." Cordelia's finger traced down the parchment. "Listen to the terms. In exchange for prosperity unending, wealth beyond measure, and dominion over the land for as long as the bloodline endures, the Fenwick family pledges the life force of every child born to their line after the sealing of this covenant. Said children shall live no more than 7 days past their birth, during which time their full potential, all years they might have lived, all experiences they might have gained, all love they might have shared, shall be consumed by the entity as payment for services rendered. But there are so many boxes in the root cellar. Surely the debt would be paid after. The debt is never paid, child. That's the beauty of the bargain, from the entity's perspective." Cordelia turned the page. "Look here, should the bloodline fail to produce tribute for a period exceeding 3 years, or should any attempt be made to break this covenant, the entire Fenwick line shall be forfeit. All blood relations, regardless of distance or generation, shall perish within 7 days, their life force claimed in full settlement of the debt." Amelia felt the baby move inside her, just the faintest flutter, but enough to remind her of what was at stake. "Cordelia, you said you were the last child born before the pact. How have you lived so long?" The old woman's face crumpled with grief. "Because I've been the one feeding children to that thing for nearly 8 decades. I've been the one preparing the birthing room, guiding the mothers through the ritual, watching as baby after baby fades away in my arms." Her voice broke. "I am the family's sin made manifest, Amelia. I am the price of our prosperity. You could have refused. You could have left. Could I? Cordelia laughed bitterly. I tried, when I was young. Made it as far as the train station in Marshall before the compulsion dragged me back. The entity doesn't just own the children, dear. It owns anyone who knows the secret. We're all bound by invisible chains, forced to participate in our own damnation. She turned to another page in the portfolio, this one covered with her own handwriting, decades of careful notes and observations. I've spent my entire life looking for a way out, studying every word of this contract, searching for loopholes or escape clauses. And I found something, Amelia. Something the entity didn't anticipate when it made its bargain. Amelia leaned forward. What? The contract specifies that the tribute must be children born to the Fenwick bloodline. But there's an addendum, written in the entity's own language, that defines exactly what constitutes payment. Cordelia's finger found a passage near the bottom of the page. The entity feeds on potential, on unlived lives, unexperienced years, unfulfilled dreams. It requires the full scope of what a human life could become. I don't understand. The entity is ancient, Amelia. It was old when your great-grandmother's great-grandmother was born. It thinks in terms of centuries, of the vast sweep of human potential across decades of life. When it made this bargain, it was thinking of children who would live to be 70 or 80 years old, all that accumulated potential feeding its hunger. Cordelia leaned closer, her eyes bright with desperate hope. But what if it could be offered something even more valuable than a single child's lifetime? What if someone willingly surrendered not just their own potential, but the accumulated wealth and power that potential had already generated? You mean give back the prosperity the family gained? More than that. Give back everything, the land, the cattle, the investments, the very foundations of Fenwick wealth. Freely surrender what the entity has given, along with the life force that made it possible. Cordelia's voice dropped to an urgent whisper. The contract allows for alternative settlement of equal or greater value, in cases where circumstances require renegotiation. Amelia's heart began to race. Would that break the covenant? I believe it would. If the entity were offered the full accumulated value of 80 years of Fenwick prosperity, freely given rather than forcibly taken, it might consider the debt settled. Cordelia closed the portfolio. But it would require a willing sacrifice. Someone would have to walk into that thing's domain and offer themselves as payment for everyone who came before. You. No, child. I'm too old, too worn down by years of complicity. My potential was spent long ago watching children die. Cordelia met Amelia's eyes. It would have to be someone young, someone carrying new life, someone whose sacrifice would represent not just their own future but the future of the entire bloodline. The implication hit Amelia like a physical blow. You're asking me to sacrifice myself and my baby. I'm offering you a choice that no Fenwick mother has had for nearly 80 years. You could save your child by destroying the source of the curse. You could end the cycle of death and suffering that has plagued this family for generations. Cordelia's voice shook with emotion. Or you could do nothing, and watch your baby die in 3 days, just as I've watched dozens of others. There has to be another way. If there is, I haven't found it in 78 years of searching. Cordelia stood, the portfolio clutched against her chest. The choice is yours, Amelia. But choose soon. The entity grows stronger with each passing day of your pregnancy, and once you enter your 7th month, the compulsion will be too strong to resist. After Cordelia left, Amelia sat alone in the cluttered room, staring at the candle flame as it danced in the winter air. Outside, the ice storm continued to rage, but inside, she felt a different kind of cold settling over her, the chill of impossible choices and desperate gambles. She thought of the boxes in the root cellar, each one representing a life cut short, a future stolen. She thought of Thomas's first child, dying slowly in his father's arms while an ancient hunger fed on his potential. She thought of her own baby, growing strong inside her, unaware of the doom that awaited. And somewhere deep beneath the house, she felt the entity stirring, patient, eternal, confident that its tribute would be delivered as always. It had waited 80 years for payment, growing fat on the stolen lives of Fenwick children. It could wait a few months more. But as Amelia placed her hand on her swelling belly, she made a promise to the child within. One way or another, this cycle of death would end with her. Even if it cost her everything she had, everything she was, everything she might become. The entity wanted potential. She would give it more potential than it had ever dreamed of consuming. She would give it a choice between continuing its feast of innocence or accepting a payment that would end its hold on the Fenwick family forever. The candle guttered out in the cold air, leaving her alone in the darkness with her resolve and the faint sound of something stirring far below, something that had grown too comfortable in its certainty that the debt would always be paid. But debt, Amelia realized, could be settled in ways the creditor never expected. And sometimes, the debtor held more power than they knew. May arrived with unseasonable heat that baked the Texas plains and filled the Fenwick house with an oppressive stillness. Amelia moved carefully now, her pregnancy heavy and obvious, the baby inside her active and strong. But with each passing day, she felt the house itself changing around her, shadows that lingered too long in corners, whispers that seemed to come from the very walls, and a growing sense that something vast and hungry was stirring beneath the foundations. The compulsion had begun 3 weeks ago, just as Cordelia had predicted. At first, it was subtle, an urge to visit the birthing room, a desire to trace the carved symbols with her fingertips. But as her due date approached, the pull grew stronger, more insistent. She found herself walking the halls at night, always ending up at the iron-banded door, her hand on the key before she could stop herself. Thomas had aged years in the past month. He barely slept, spending his nights watching over her with the desperate intensity of a man trying to hold back the tide. Dr. Morrison visited daily now, his medical bag supplemented with items that had nothing to do with obstetrics, iron filings, blessed water, protective symbols drawn on parchment. "The baby's head is engaged," he announced after his latest examination, his voice carefully neutral. "Labor could begin any time in the next few days." Amelia nodded, but her attention was focused elsewhere. Through the bedroom floor, she could feel vibrations, a rhythmic pulsing that seemed to match her own heartbeat. The entity was fully awake now, calling to the new life inside her with a hunger that made her stomach turn. That evening, as Thomas met with Dr. Morrison in his study to discuss final preparations, Amelia made her way to Cordelia's room. She found the old woman sitting by her window, staring out at the family cemetery where generations of Fenwick headstones stood like silent sentinels. "It's time, isn't it?" Cordelia asked without turning around. "Yes. I can feel it building, the labor, the compulsion. By tomorrow night, I won't be able to resist anymore." Amelia sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded over her swollen belly. "I've made my decision." "Tell me." "I'm going to offer myself to the entity. Not as a victim, but as a negotiator. I'll present Cordelia's alternative settlement, the return of all Fenwick wealth and prosperity in exchange for the breaking of the covenant." Amelia's voice was steady, though her heart raced with fear. "If it accepts, the curse ends. If it refuses. If it refuses, you and the baby die, and the cycle continues." Cordelia finally turned from the window, her ancient eyes filled with sorrow. "Amelia, you don't understand what you're walking into. This entity isn't human. It doesn't think like we do, doesn't value the things we value. It might simply take what you offer and demand the child as well. Then I'll make sure it can't have both." Amelia withdrew a small vial from her pocket, a mixture she'd prepared from herbs in the garden and knowledge gleaned from the books in Thomas's study. If the negotiation fails, this will ensure that neither the baby nor I suffer through the slow consumption. It will be quick, peaceful. Child, no. It's better than watching my baby fade away over 3 days. It's better than becoming another keeper of the curse, another generation forced to feed children to that thing. Amelia stood, her resolve hardening. I won't let my child become another box in the root cellar. Cordelia was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. What do you need from me? The contract. And your blessing. You have both. The first contraction hit Amelia just after midnight, a wave of pain that seemed to resonate through the house itself. She felt the compulsion surge, an overwhelming need to make her way to the birthing room, to submit to the ritual that had claimed so many before her. But she fought it, focusing instead on the plan she'd spent months preparing. Thomas found her in their bedroom, dressed and ready, the leather portfolio containing the contract under her arm. Amelia, what are you doing? You need to lie down, let me call Dr. Morrison. No, Thomas. Not this time. She kissed him gently, tasting the salt of tears she hadn't realized she'd shed. I'm going to end this. Tonight. You can't fight the compulsion. No one has ever been able to. I'm not fighting it. I'm using it. Another contraction gripped her, stronger than the first. The entity wants me in that room. But it's expecting a victim, not a negotiator. Thomas grabbed her hands, his face wild with panic. This is madness. We'll leave right now, drive to Marshall, have the baby at the hospital. You know that won't work. The compulsion is too strong now. If I try to leave, I'll only collapse somewhere between here and town, and the baby will be born on the roadside with no protection at all. Amelia pulled free from his grip. This is the only way, Thomas. Trust me. The walk to the birthing room felt like a journey through a nightmare. With each step, the house seemed to shift around her, walls breathing, floors pulsing, shadows reaching out with grasping fingers. The compulsion drove her forward, but for the first time in Fenwick history, the one being compelled was walking willingly toward her destination. The door to the birthing room stood open, though she was certain Thomas had locked it that morning. Inside, the carved symbols on the floor were glowing with a sickly green light that pulsed in rhythm with her contractions. The air itself felt thick, charged with an energy that made her skin crawl. But Amelia didn't go to the bed. Instead, she moved to the center of the room and placed the contract on the floor, directly over the largest of the carved symbols. I know you can hear me, she said aloud, her voice echoing strangely in the circular chamber. I know you're listening. I've come to make you an offer. The temperature in the room plummeted, and the green glow intensified. From somewhere far below, she heard movement, something vast and ancient stirring in depths that predated human civilization. I offer you a renegotiation of the Fenwick Covenant, Amelia continued, fighting through another contraction. I offer you the full accumulated wealth and prosperity of 80 years, freely given, not taken by force. I offer you the life force that created this empire, willingly surrendered by one who has the right to make such a choice. The movement below grew stronger, and she felt a presence pressing against her mind, alien, hungry, impossibly old. When it spoke, the words formed directly in her thoughts, bypassing her ears entirely. The covenant is sealed. The tribute is owed. The child will be claimed. The contract allows for alternative settlement of equal or greater value. I've read the terms, I know my rights as a party to this agreement. Amelia forced herself to remain standing as the pressure in her head intensified. I offer you something worth more than a single child's potential, I offer you the voluntary return of everything you've given the Fenwick family, freely surrendered by blood and will. The child. Give me the child, and we will speak of renegotiation. No. You get nothing until you agree to new terms. Break the covenant, release the bloodline from its obligations, and I'll give you wealth beyond anything you've claimed before. Continue to demand children, and you get nothing, not the baby, not me, not another generation of Fenwick tribute. Another contraction, stronger than any before, brought her to her knees. The entity's presence pressed closer, and she felt its hunger, vast, endless, patient. But beneath the hunger, she sensed something else, curiosity. In 80 years of tribute, no one had ever tried to negotiate with it. You would die to deny me one child. I would die to save all children. I would die to break a cycle of murder that has gone on too long. Amelia pulled the vial from her pocket, her hand shaking as another wave of pain crashed over her. Choose. Accept my offer and gain more wealth than you've accumulated in decades of feeding on innocence. Or refuse, and watch me destroy both myself and the child before you can claim either of us. The silence stretched for an eternity. Then, slowly, the green glow began to change, shifting from sickly radiance to something cleaner, brighter. The presence in her mind shifted as well, becoming less predatory, more interested. Show me this wealth you offer. Everything. The land, the cattle, the investments, the very foundations of Fenwick prosperity. The accumulated life force of 8 decades of unnatural success, freely given back to the source. Another contraction, and she felt the baby beginning its journey into the world. But only if you break the covenant completely. Only if you swear by whatever powers bind you that no future Fenwick child will ever be claimed. And if I refuse? Amelia raised the vial to her lips. Then you get nothing. And the cycle ends here, with me, in defiance rather than submission. The entity was quiet for a long moment, and she felt it reaching through time and space, examining the wealth she offered, weighing it against decades of future tribute. When it spoke again, its mental voice carried something that might have been, respect. You are not like the others. You do not beg or bargain from fear. You offer from strength. I offer from love. Love for my child, love for my husband, love for all the children who died needlessly because their parents had no choice. Amelia's vision blurred as the baby's head crowned, but she maintained her grip on the vial. What is your answer? I accept. The words hit her like a physical blow, and she felt something vast and fundamental shift in the fabric of reality around her. The contract on the floor burst into flames that cast no heat, burning away to nothing in seconds. The carved symbols on the floor cracked and crumbled, their power broken forever. Take your child and go. The covenant is broken. The bloodline is free. Amelia collapsed as the final contraction seized her, but instead of the cold stone floor, she found herself caught in Thomas's arms. He had come for her, as she'd known he would, arriving just in time to help bring their daughter into a world free from ancient hungers. The baby's cry filled the room, strong, healthy, and completely human. No shadows reached for her, no alien presence stirred beneath the earth. For the first time in 80 years, a Fenwick child would live to see her second day. As Thomas helped Amelia to her feet, she looked around the birthing room one last time. The symbols were gone, the walls were just stone, and the oppressive atmosphere had lifted completely. In its place was ordinary air, ordinary silence, and the extraordinary sound of their daughter's breathing. Is it over? Thomas whispered. It's over, Amelia confirmed, though she could barely speak past her exhaustion and relief. The covenant is broken. Our daughter is free. They named her Hope. 6 months after Hope's birth, Amelia sat in the ruins of what had once been the grand Fenwick estate, watching her daughter take her first tentative steps across the charred grass. The house had burned exactly 1 week after the covenant was broken, not from any supernatural cause, but from Amelia's own hand. She had kept her promise to the entity, surrendering not just the wealth but the very symbols of Fenwick prosperity. The fire had started in the birthing room and spread with unnatural speed, consuming decades of accumulated grandeur in a single night. The servants had escaped safely, their severance pay generous enough to ensure comfortable new positions elsewhere. Dr. Morrison had arranged for the family's financial assets to be liquidated and distributed among charities, hospitals, orphanages, schools for children who would now have chances the Fenwick tribute might have stolen. Thomas emerged from the small cabin they'd built on the edge of the property, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing clothes that bore the honest stains of manual labor. The railroad had hired him as a surveyor, work that paid modestly but required no inheritance of blood or curse. He looked younger somehow, as if a weight he'd carried his entire life had finally been lifted. "Any regrets?" he asked, settling beside her on the porch steps they'd built themselves. Amelia looked out over the land that was no longer theirs, sold to a family from Louisiana who planned to raise cotton and corn, crops that would grow from honest soil rather than supernatural bargains. In the distance, she could see the workers they'd hired to demolish the family cemetery, moving the headstones to a proper graveyard in town where the dead could rest without the shadow of ancient hungers. "None," she said, and meant it. "This feels more like home than that mansion ever did." Hope babbled something that might have been "mama" or might have been "bird." She developed a fascination with the sparrows that nested in the oak tree beside their cabin. Thomas scooped her up, and she laughed with the pure joy that only comes from a child who has never known fear, never sensed the weight of supernatural dread pressing down on her cradle. "What will we tell her when she's older?" Thomas asked. "About her family, about what we escaped." Amelia took out the new family ledger she'd been keeping, a simple notebook purchased in town, its pages filled with ordinary entries recording ordinary lives. Hope's birth, her first smile, her first word, her first step. A future being written day by day without the shadow of predetermined doom. "We'll tell her the truth," Amelia said. "That sometimes the greatest courage is knowing when to let go of the past. That wealth built on others' suffering isn't worth keeping. That love means being willing to sacrifice everything to protect what matters most." She opened the ledger to a fresh page and began to write, November 15, 1890. Hope Fenwick took her first unassisted steps today. Her future stretches ahead of her, unmarked by debt or darkness, limited only by her own dreams and determination. Cordelia had passed away peacefully in her sleep 2 months after the covenant was broken, finally released from her role as keeper of the family's darkest secrets. Her last words, whispered to Amelia in the moments before she slipped away, had been simple: "Thank you for giving me permission to die." The old woman had left behind rooms full of research, decades of careful documentation about the supernatural forces that preyed on human desperation. Amelia had burned most of it, but kept enough to remember, to ensure that future generations would understand the price of making bargains with entities that measured time in centuries rather than years. The Morrison boy asked if he could come calling on Sunday, Thomas said, bouncing Hope on his knee. "I told him he'd have to wait about 17 years. Amelia laughed, the sound carrying across the autumn air like a promise. "I think Hope will have plenty to say about that when the time comes. She's going to have choices we never dreamed of." As the sun set over the Texas plains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Amelia felt a deep satisfaction settle in her bones. They had lost wealth, status, the grand legacy of the Fenwick name. But they had gained something infinitely more valuable, the right to write their own story, to build a future on their own terms. Hope would grow up to be a teacher, though Amelia couldn't know that yet. She would marry for love, raise children who never knew hunger or fear, and live to see her great-grandchildren playing in gardens where nothing more sinister than earthworms stirred beneath the soil. The Fenwick name would continue, but freed from its dark inheritance, carrying only the light its bearers chose to kindle. That night, as Amelia tucked Hope into her simple wooden cradle, she whispered the same prayer she'd offered every evening since the covenant was broken: "May you live to be old and gray, my darling. May you experience every day you're meant to have. May your potential be yours alone to spend. Through the cabin window, the stars shone down on land that was no longer cursed, on a family that was no longer bound by the sins of previous generations. And somewhere in the darkness, the absence of an ancient hunger was almost tangible, a peace that settled over the earth like a blanket, covering all the places where unnatural appetites had once stirred. The Fenwick family tree would grow again, its branches reaching toward sunlight rather than shadow. And every leaf, every flower, every fruit it bore would be earned through honest effort rather than stolen from the potential of innocence. If you followed Amelia's journey to the end and believe some things are worth more than money or power, comment, the tree grows again.